Welcome to the Deep Dive. If your newsfeed has been anything like ours this past week, well, you've seen the headlines. They're pretty urgent. For the past 7 days now, as of June 19th, 2025, Israel and Iran have been locked in this escalating exchange of strikes. And you can really feel the uncertainty in the air. It's easy to get lost in all the daily updates, right? Feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed by just the sheer amount of information flying around. So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that noise. We've gathered quite a stack of sources for this deep dive. We're drawing on insights from big names like Al Jazeera, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's CSIS, the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, and also vital reports from the International Organization for Migration, the IOM. We've even pulled in some analysis from presentations at Harvard Kennedy School and look at discussions happening on places like Reddit. So we're here to help you quickly grasp what's most critical from all these different materials. Think of it as a shortcut to being, well, genuinely informed.
We'll cover some surprising facts, some practical takeaways on what is, let's face it, an incredibly complex geopolitical situation. Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about conflict, the military actions, the strikes, that's often what grabs our attention first. It's dramatic. But what about the less visible side, the economic toll this escalating situation is taking on both Israel and Iran? It's a really critical angle, I think, and one that often gets overshadowed. But our sources, they shed quite a bit of light on it.
Yeah, they really do. And a critical insight here is just how much Israel's defense spending had already surged, even before this latest intensification. Our sources show Israel's defense budget jumped from about 60 billion shekels, that's roughly, $17 billion in 2023. Then it climbed to a projected 99 billion or $28 billion in 2024. And for 2025, forecasts put it at an astonishing 118 billion shekels. That's around $34 billion.
Wow, $34 billion. That's a huge number.
It is. And just to put that in perspective, that's roughly double what Israel spent just 2 years ago. And it's pushing their projected budget deficit to an unprecedented 4.9% of GDP.
Almost 5%. That feels high for a deficit ceiling.
It is high. And that's a level that, well, according to some analyses we looked at, it could really force some difficult decisions, on social programs or maybe infrastructure investment. It essentially means reallocating funds directly away from citizen services and straight into defense.
Right. And connecting that to the wider economy. Are there signs of stress showing up already?
Oh, absolutely. Israel's economy is indeed showing palpable signs of stress. Its 2025 growth forecast, for instance, has been revised down. It was 4.3%. Now it's projected at 3.6%.
Okay, 0.7% down. It might sound small in isolation, but...
Exactly. But when you consider it alongside the fact that roughly 60,000 Israeli companies, 60,000 closed in 2024.
60,000. Wow.
Why? Well, the sources point to manpower shortages, big logistics disruptions, and just a significant dip in overall business sentiment. It really paints a picture of an economy facing maybe a potential structural shift, not just some temporary dip. And tourism, which is a crucial sector for Israel, right? Tourist arrivals also remain significantly below where they were before October 2023, so that's another strain.
Okay, so Israel is clearly feeling this immense fiscal burden, these economic ripple effects. How does this compare to Iran? I mean, Iran's a nation already used to operating under pretty heavy international sanctions.
Yeah, that's a good point. But Iran is facing even more profound and immediate economic pressure right now. Its oil exports, which are absolutely crucial for state revenue, they've plummeted dramatically. Just look at the week ending last Sunday, exports fell to just 102,000 barrels per day. That's less than half of its average for this year.
Less than half. That's a massive drop.
It is. And here's the really striking detail from our sources. Exports from Karg Island now. Karg Island typically handles over 90% of Iran's oil. They appear to have completely halted.
Completely stopped. Wow. That's got to be a massive blow.
Huge blow. And furthermore, the South Pars gas field, this is the world's largest gas field, responsible for about 80% of Iran's domestic gas output. It was directly hit by Israeli missiles, and it's now partially suspended. Imagine losing a significant chunk of your energy production capacity, just like that.
That's devastating.
Yeah.
And what about things like inflation, the currency?
Yeah. We'll add to this the currency, the real. It has shed over 90% of its value against the U.S. dollar since sanctions were reimposed back in 2018. 90%. Official inflation figures, they hover around 40%, but some experts we looked at estimate it's actually over 50%.
Over 50% inflation.
And our sources reveal a really grim statistic. Somewhere between 22 and 27% of Iranians are now living below the poverty line. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a military budget estimated at only around $12 billion. That's just 3.5% of their GDP.
Which raises serious questions, doesn't it, about its sustainability if this conflict drags on?
Exactly. Can they sustain this level of military activity with those economic pressures? It's a big question.
It's really clear, then, that for both nations, these military actions aren't just tactical moves on a chessboard. They carry these immense and seemingly increasingly unsustainable economic costs. Every decision becomes a high-stakes gamble, which leads us right into Iran's strategic options. Given these, frankly, crippling economic pressures you've described, what's actually in Iran's military playbook for retaliation? And crucially, how effective might those moves realistically be against Israel's defenses, which we know are formidable?
Well, historically, Iran has certainly developed a diverse playbook for retaliation. Our sources detail various methods, things like attacks on commercial ships, leveraging their proxy groups across the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis, others, sophisticated cyber operations too, and even threats. Remember those threats? To close the Strait of Hormuz, that vital oil choke point.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz threats always get attention.
They do. But more directly, they've relied on salvos of missiles and drones. And the most likely immediate response, as several analyses suggest, would probably be these firepower strikes. That means combinations of cruise and ballistic missiles launched alongside waves, big waves, of drone attacks. The idea is to try and overwhelm Israeli air defenses through just sheer volume.
And we've seen them try this before, haven't we?
We have. To understand their potential approach now, it really helps to look at their past major firepower demonstrations. Back in 2019, for example, Iranian-backed militias used drones and missiles to attack key Saudi oil facilities. That disrupted a staggering 5.7 million barrels per day of global oil supply. A huge impact. Then, in January 2020, Iran directly launched over a dozen ballistic missiles from its own territory at U.S. bases in Iraq. That was a direct state-on-state action.
And the most recent big one against Israel, Operation True Promise.
Exactly. Operation True Promise in April 2024. That was the most relevant large-scale retaliation. Iran launched, estimates are around 170 drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 120 ballistic missiles, all targeting Israel directly. But what's really striking from our sources is that despite the sheer volume of that attack, hundreds of projectiles, it actually did very little damage.
Very little damage. Why was that?
Well, it was largely due to Israel's incredibly sophisticated, multi-layered air defenses, systems like Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, combined with crucial support from allies. The United States, the UK, France, even Jordan helped intercept them.
That's a powerful demonstration of Israel's defense capabilities, no doubt. But thinking about that massive volley in Operation True Promise, does our source material suggest any alternative interpretations of Iran's intent there? I mean, was it truly aimed at causing maximum damage? Or was there perhaps a symbolic message involved? Maybe knowing the defenses would likely stop most of it, but sending a signal anyway. And how does that affect their options now?
That's an excellent question, and it's definitely something analysts are still debating. A symbolic message was certainly part of it, absolutely, demonstrating reach, demonstrating resolve. But the damage sustained was far, far less than what Iran likely hoped for, even symbolically. What it really underscored, quite starkly, is that Israel's air defense capabilities are just among the highest per capita and per square mile anywhere in the world. This makes small or even medium-sized attacks much less effective than they might be against other targets.
So drones and missiles, their go-to options, face a real challenge.
A huge challenge. While Iran does have substantial drone stockpiles, their effectiveness against Israel specifically is highly questionable. Think about the distance they need to travel facing these advanced defense systems all the way. And as for ballistic missiles, Iran has an estimated inventory of around 3,000. But maybe only about 1,000 of those are likely available and capable of actually reaching Israel. And remember, some of those have already been hit in what Israel calls Operation Rising Lion, those initial strategic strikes that kicked off this latest escalation.
So Iran's facing a dilemma.
A real dilemma. Do they attempt a few more massive salvos, knowing the likely limited impact and the high cost? Or can their relatively smaller military budget, the one we talked about, maybe $12 billion, can it even sustain a prolonged campaign of that intensity? It seems doubtful.
And what about pulling others into the fight, the U.S., Gulf states?
Well, our sources also indicate that despite whatever domestic pressure they might feel, Iran will likely remain reluctant to take actions that would unequivocally draw the Gulf states and the United States into a broader direct regional war. They probably want to avoid that wider conflict. So the immediate challenge for the U.S. really remains, exactly how much assistance to offer Israel in defending its skies, and also what lines not to cross, especially if Iran chooses maybe to escalate in less conventional ways.
Okay, so we've looked at the immense economic pressures, the strategic military realities, the capabilities, the limitations. But this deep dive also reveals that beyond just the visible exchanges of fire, there's this complex, deeply entrenched political game being played, and it seems rooted in very different strategic viewpoints. Let's dig into those.
Indeed. It's crucial. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for instance, has laid out 3 core objectives for Israel's military campaign, as he sees it. First, dismantling Iran's nuclear program. That's been a long-standing goal. Second, destroying its ballistic missile capabilities, also a key concern. And third, dismantling what he calls its terror axis. Now, what's fascinating here, according to our sources, is that this third objective is deliberately, maybe strategically vague.
Vague how?
Well, it echoes the kind of open-ended language Israel used regarding its operations in Gaza. It suggests a broader, perhaps much more ambitious goal than just immediate defense. Maybe leveraging military pressure for internal political upheaval within Iran, potentially even aiming, some analysts suggest, for actual regime change. That's a very big goal.
Okay, regime change is a huge claim. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, I think, especially when we look at the U.S. role in all this. How has the United States, particularly thinking back to the former Trump administration, approached this incredibly sensitive situation? It feels like a crucial dimension we need to understand.
It absolutely is. Our sources note that while former President Trump apparently initially cautioned against a direct Israeli strike like this, the fact that the U.S. was informed in advance and quietly evacuated non-essential personnel from the region beforehand, well, that suggests a sort of tacit green light. Reluctant, maybe, but a green light nonetheless.
And Trump's public comments afterwards.
Right. Trump later publicly praised Operation Rising Lion, remember, that's Israel's initial strategic strikes in this current round. He called it excellent. He seemed to view these actions as potential leverage, maybe, to force Iran into a more amenable negotiating position, particularly thinking about a renewed nuclear deal, but on his terms.
So a transactional approach, using military pressure as a bargaining chip.
Exactly. That transactional approach to diplomacy, it's a key element of his past strategy. But it's complex. We also see a division, sources point out, within his own Republican base. Some strongly support Israel's actions, no question, but others are emphasizing a more isolationist stance, saying, this is not our war. So, not monolithic support even there.
That brings us to a really important point, doesn't it? About the effectiveness, or maybe ineffectiveness, of sanctions versus diplomatic deals in this whole context.
Definitely. There's this viewpoint identified in our sources as the Trump-Netanyahu-Sari view, which explicitly argues that the 2015 JCPOA, that's the official name for the Iran nuclear deal, was fundamentally a poor agreement.
They thought it was a bad deal.
Yes. Their argument is that stronger sanctions, maybe even military strikes back then, could have actually forced Iran to capitulate completely. Their perspective is that lifting sanctions under the JCPOA simply gave Iran, more resources, more money to fund its missile program and to support groups they view as terrorists.
Okay, that's one clear perspective. What about the Iranian side? How do they see sanctions and deals, especially with the U.S.?
Well, on the Iranian side, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has historically expressed deep, deep mistrust of U.S. intentions, just profound distrust. He tends to view sanctions not really as a tool to change behavior, but as a deliberate attempt to humiliate and weaken Iran, to bring it to its knees. We found quotes from him even back in 2012 dismissing claims that sanctions would be lifted if Iran just ignored nuclear energy. He attributed it to what he called a long-cherished hostility from the West.
So that view reinforces a hardline stance?
Absolutely. It reinforces the view that the U.S. simply cannot be trusted, that the ultimate goal is overthrowing the regime, and that pushes Iran, logically from their perspective, to acquire more leverage. How? By advancing its nuclear program.
Which highlights the importance of credibility and diplomacy, right?
Exactly. This dynamic really highlights the crucial role of credibility, especially of promises, in coercive diplomacy. Many argue that Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA back in 2018 severely undermined the credibility of any U.S. promises. And that's a factor that continues to complicate broader diplomatic efforts, not just with Iran, but globally, even today.
It really is a complex dance, isn't it? Leverage, profound distrust, constantly shifting objectives, where past actions and, perceived betrayals heavily influence how everyone sees the situation right now. So we've explored the grand strategies, the crushing economic calculations, but while we analyze these high-level dynamics, it's just vital to remember that every single decision, every strike, it has a profound, tangible human cost.
Yeah.
What resources tell us about the real-world impact on the ground for ordinary people caught in the middle of this?
Yeah, it's critical not to lose sight of that. The International Organization for Migration's, the IOM's 2024-2025 Crisis Response Plan for Iran paints a really stark picture. It shows a nation already grappling with immense humanitarian challenges even before this latest military escalation. For instance, Iran hosts one of the world's largest migrant and refugee populations, primarily Afghans. We're talking millions, both documented and undocumented. Millions. And recent developments, according to the IOM, show an intensification of deportations and also a worrying rise in anti-migrant sentiment within Iran. That creates a really precarious situation for these vulnerable populations.
And that's on top of other existing issues.
Yes. Beyond the conflict, Iran is highly vulnerable to the escalating impacts of climate change. They're experiencing severe droughts, frequent, really disruptive dust storms. These displace millions and just exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. Plus, add the constant threat of catastrophic earthquakes. Iran is in a very seismically active zone. Earthquakes have historically devastated communities there.
So multiple layers of crisis.
Exactly. And you combine all that with the rising poverty we discussed earlier, remember, that 22 to 27% of Iranians now living below the poverty line and just insufficient job creation. It translates into a daily struggle for millions. These economic wounds mean things like reduced access to essential services, like basic health care. It means increased food insecurity for vulnerable families, and just the general erosion of the social safety net. It's a grim reality, unfortunately. And it's a powerful reminder that these high-level geopolitical struggles, well, they disproportionately burden the most vulnerable citizens on the ground.
It really is a stark and frankly sobering reminder. These geopolitical games have very tangible, sometimes devastating consequences for real people, real families. This deep dive has really shown us, I think, the intricate layers of this conflict, from those immense economic vulnerabilities we started with, to the calculated military strategies, the capabilities, the limitations, all the way to the deeply entrenched political views driving decisions, and finally, these profound humanitarian challenges unfolding right now.
Yeah, and what really stands out, I think, in pulling all this analysis together is how these differing strategic approaches will ultimately shape the immediate future. Whether it's Israel's assertive push for what they see as a decisive outcome, or maybe Iran's posture of strategic patience, as they sometimes call it, under intense duress, how these play out is key. And the long-term impact on regional stability, on global oil markets, that remains a critical and, frankly, quite unpredictable unknown at this point.
So after exploring all this, what does it all mean for you as you watch these events unfold, as you try to make sense of those daily headlines that keep coming?
Well, the ongoing Israel-Iran conflict, which, as we've seen, is deeply rooted in decades of historical distrust and just fundamentally conflicting strategic objectives, it presents a really critical case study, a case study in how nations weigh the immediate, often brutal costs of conflict against these much broader, longer-term geopolitical aims. We've examined viewpoints, particularly from sources reflecting the Trump-Netanyahu Saudi thinking, that strongly advocate for leveraging military pressure, using severe sanctions, aiming for really significant outcomes, potentially, even, as we discussed, regime change. And this raises, I think, an important question for all of us to consider, to mull over. Will such high-stakes approaches, this kind of maximalist pressure, will it truly lead to the desired political shifts? Or, perhaps paradoxically, do these approaches risk further entrenching the existing powers? Do they risk ultimately deepening the instability in what is already an incredibly volatile and, let's face it, long-suffering region?
It's a tough question, and it's one that history and certainly the sources we've looked at today compel us to ponder very deeply.